Thanks for having me, everyone. My name is Will Chan. I'm the Director of Strategy of External Affairs and Strategy for Denver Economic Development and Opportunity. So Stella asked me to come today, so I just want to thank the Colorado Roundtable for having me. So I'm in charge of a lot of the American Rescue Funds, the COVID relief funds for the city. So how do we have access to that? How do we help you guys access those funds, and how do we support you? And so here to talk about nonprofit organization, resilience building, and then also general fundraising. So I think there's actually two parts to this. So excuse my rambling. I think I speak very fast, so I'll probably get you guys caught up on time. But I think I'm going to talk about two things today. So the nonprofit fundraising piece is one half, but then the organizational resilience. And I think one piece from the past year, working with so many nonprofits across the city that are working on so many different issues, I think just trying to help you guys kind of come together and really drive down what the mission is and what you guys are trying to do to create that messaging, create that story for you to access and be really competitive in those funds. And then the second half, I'll give some access to different resources that you guys can apply for. Thanks, Peter. Of course. Is this better? No, Lord. So the nonprofit model, just I know a lot of you guys are here already know this, but it's a third for earned revenue. It's a third for grants. It's a third for donors. That whole model has changed, obviously, in the past year. Grants are more abundant if you look at donor-advised funds. Donors, in every recession, every crisis, you'll see a decrease. And earned revenue, all of you guys have probably shuttered shops, and so you guys aren't going to have as much of the programming to get some of those streams of revenue. So how do we help you diversify that? How do you think creatively in how you fundraise and get money in different ways for your organizations? But thinking about it too, and I think one woman over there was talking about data earlier. That is really important. I think a lot of nonprofits don't have the data and the resources available to know their audience, to apply for those funds, and to know and understand your audience so deeply that you can create a compelling narrative and compelling story for your grant applications. Thinking about administration in your planning, I think rethinking about that as well as you are moving forward. There's a crap ton of nonprofits in Colorado. I think in terms of our per capita, we are second to DC. And so I think we really need to think about how your role in this community, yes, we're all serving APIs in here, this room, but what are the other intersections in your nonprofit? Are you duplicating roles? Can you collaborate with someone else? What are some of the other options that you can think about in terms of gaining access and diversifying your streams of revenue? So the administration and planning piece, as Peter's moved through the slides for me, I think there's four pieces I'll talk about. The intersectional programming. I think a lot of the social justice needs that have come out have really been prioritized in the past year. A lot of people are working in the food access space. A lot of people are working in the racial equity space. But instead of cannibalizing each other, how can you reach across other ethnic groups? How do you reach across other thematic organizations, the art groups, the food justice groups, whatever those pieces are, to work together to leverage those funds and create a more stronger application if you guys are collaborating. So think about that intersectional programming. If you are working on API hate, how can you work with the Asian Bar Association? How can you work if you're working with immigrants and kind of the invisibility of that community? How can you work with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs? And so think creatively about your programming and leveraging those funds. I think it's always stronger if you're a collective together instead of alone. So when you're thinking about your programming, there's other options, and people have a lot of money and have a lot of funds, but people are still in those silos, and so how can you work better together? Go back, Peter. Sorry. So that was the collaborating and sharing resources. And again, we have a lot of nonprofits per capita in Denver. And I think there's a lot of ego involved. And so I think thinking about the greater good right now too, and what you're doing for that public service, how are you helping the community? And if you are able to remove yourself and think about your mission as nonprofits, you're mission driven, who as that audience, who is that population? And I think what I see is kind of a failing for a lot of nonprofits is the ego of the staff and the leadership. And so I think that's a piece that's like hard. I think a lot of people are burnt out right now as you're in this space too, but how can you really think back to the mission? And I think that's what like motivates you and makes you keep going in this space. But really think about, okay, I need to, whatever the personal relationships you may have with another organization that might be competing for the same funds, how can you reach and work with them a little bit better? Thinking about short-term and long-term planning, again, the past 18 months has been very short-term. We're very reactive, and I think everyone's chasing after like these short-term funds. But I think in terms of Colorado, like we are at a tipping point, and especially for Asians. Peter shared some census data as well. Like Asians were the fastest-growing group. I think increasing by 37% compared to I think every other minority group in the Denver metro area. It's like 2%, like if anything, it would remain status quo. So I think we're getting to grow in terms of a like power pack in a group. And so leveraging that like data and knowing that that's the community that we have right now, how can we show up in long term, like knowing that our communities are going to keep growing over the next like decades and decades. Thinking about that long-term piece, instead of chasing after funds right now, thinking about that long-term planning, apply for those strategic planning grants, work with groups that might be complementary in your services, thinking about that long-term planning if you can afford that time in your strategic goals. Tailoring your communication. Again, we had some resources earlier talking about media pieces for API populations, but you have very niche communities that you're working with. There's 35 API groups in the diaspora. You have very different needs for your communities. And so, again, the language justice piece, there's a lot of money in that space too, but what are the specific needs for your communities? Is the Vietnamese community more in the immigration space? Is the Hmong population more in the homelessness space? Like, so what is the like specific needs that you can really tailor that communication, tailor that outreach, and really focus your goals? I think there's so many things that we, I think, as API leaders in the space, want to do everything for everyone. And it's like, okay, like we need food, we need housing, we need like representation, and I think that's just a disservice. So you're going to burn out, and that's too much for one person and one group to handle. And so thinking about like, I just want to focus on one very specific goal, and I want to do it really well. And so thinking about quality over quantity. Next slide. So that quality over quantity piece is so important too. I think whenever I read grant applications, it's the groups that know that specific, are subject matter expertise in one specific area, instead of having a broader reach. And so if it is the community that you're serving, that's great. But what exactly is it in that community? Is it mental health? Is a big piece for API populations right now. Thinking about what that thematic piece is and how can you really like drive at that data. Thinking more about outcomes in terms of outputs. And so I think in terms of the short term, a lot of people think about how many people are coming to my program, how many people are signing up for a training, but for what end? Like thinking about that goal is like, okay, I want people to show up for this training because I want them to feel empowered. I want to increase the civic engagement of APIs in this space. Like thinking about that, like why again, so that you have a stronger kind of reason for chasing after money and chasing after kind of collaborations. Thinking about the audience, I've talked about the diaspora, but who, knowing well, like the age of the demographics, I think those are really strong pieces as well. Like we are a very young city, but we have a silver tsunami, especially with the Asian communities. So how are you working with this community, knowing that we're older and very young as well? And so really focusing your needs on those communities and knowing that community very well too. And knowing the needs. If you know the demographics and you know it's mostly seniors, then maybe it is more mental health. Maybe it is aging in home. Maybe it is home care, like those pieces as well. So I think go through some of the research and this data that is available online in the resources to really get a better sense of like all the communities. I think we have this bubble that we all live in, and we think we know who the communities are, but challenge yourself and push yourself, and it's like, okay, what are the gaps I'm serving? Is it really like this is the community? If this is the niche, this is the group that I'm working with, am I really like doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it holds you accountable. I think when you're going after public funds and grant funds, you need to have this data to report back out on. And if you have that data, you can leverage it for so much more. And I think that's what is the strong piece for us is if we have that data, we can get more money. If we have that data, that disaggregated data, especially for Asian communities too, we can actually bring more legislators to focus on the policy issues for our community. We are not as large right now. I think even though we grew by 37%, we're still at 4% as APIs in the state. But again, if we have that data to kind of push policymakers, to push grant makers to say, we are here, we need to be heard, and these are the needs, and I have the data to back it up, they can't ignore that. And then the final slide is diversification. I think I talked about donor decline right now, and so it's very hard to get donors to fundraise in that space. And so usually it takes about 2 years for donors to come back and donate money after a recession, after a crisis. But in nonprofit space, to be resilient, you have that crisis management. And so I think now is a time when we have so much in terms of the public funding to really think about the grant funding from federal, so the Department of Justice, the Department of Human Service. So I think there's community service as well. There's federal grants that will be coming down. From the city and the state level, our recovery dollars and our stimulus funds will probably come out first quarter of next year. And so keep a lookout for those. Sign up for RSS feeds. And if you need, I'll give you my email and I'll send those out when we have them. But there's a lot of funding that is coming out for nonprofits specifically to build up your capacity and build up your services to direct service to community. In terms of corporate giving, I don't think a lot of nonprofits you can leverage, especially when something happens to our community and that flashpoint happens, go out and reach the corporate sponsors. Go to Wells Fargo, go to the banks, go to Delta Dental, groups that have corporate social responsibility, they always have a chunk of money that's always allocated to serve community, especially in this past year, it's just giving that community money out. I saw a lot in the Black Lives Matter space, but not a lot in the Asian space for getting access to those funds. And so I would really push you guys to reach the corporate sponsors that do have that money, that are trying to check off a box for community, for better or worse. But again, it's another way to show up and advocate for the community. Grants, again, we've talked a little bit about. There's going to be a lot of grants, but philanthropy right now is really thinking about ethnicities and racial groups very specifically. So that's a space where they are driving the focus and the prioritization of where funding is going out, and really thinking about that collective impact model. And so look at Colorado Health Foundation, Denver Foundation. There's a lot of places here locally that are giving money to specific ethnic groups as well, and the diaspora. But again, how are we really pushing that? I think it's more about the broad piece, but I don't know if they're drilling down quite yet. So I think that's a piece of really advocating and talking to, meeting with a grant advisor and a grant liaison at one of those organizations. And the wonderful thing about being in Denver is you can raise your hand and have a seat at the table. So if you haven't already, talk to those foundations. It's I represent X community, X organization. This is what I'm seeing. How can you help me serve this community better? This is the barriers I have so far, and everyone wants to help, and no one knows how to do it. So the resources are there. It's just challenging you to have that initiative to do the outreach. I think you see the grants and it's oh yeah, I'm just going to apply and try to be competitive, but it's a lot of that relationship building that you can foster as well ahead of time. And so thinking about that transformational piece, philanthropy really wants to make a grand impact. It's not just about giving money for this, well, sometimes it is. But giving money is say, I gave X amount of dollars to help Asians, yay me. But it's really to say, we're helping this community so that we can be more equitable, we can be more inclusive, we can be better and make our community a better space to live in. And so I think foster those relationships with other leaders in the space, get to know each other today, get to know your legislators, your policymakers, get to know the foundations. I think one thing that we are coming out of this pandemic pandemic is that we need to work together, that we can't get out of this alone. And so thinking about the connections that you have and that network and how can you expand that out. The local and national, and so I mentioned the bar association, the Asian bar. We have a Colorado chapter, and so also reach out to the national chapter as well. The national chapters and the umbrella organizations always have a lot of funds that I don't think a lot of like the small organizations like, oh, like I'm a small group that only serves like 5 people that I'm not going to apply for. I'm like, it's a lot of resource, but if you come together as an umbrella, as a collective, and have one lead organization that might have more capacity to be the lead grant applicant, and then maybe 5 groups underneath. Yeah, it's a lot of administrative pieces, but you have a stronger impact to serve the community. You're more competitive in terms of your grant, and you are more competitive on the national level to obtain that funding. And you can share the burden of the administrative costs. And then income generation too. Because you know your community so well, you know what you can provide. Thinking about the consulting service. Everyone's talking about EDI and justice, right, in this space right now. So can you, like, instead of having the donor donors piece for your revenue generation, thinking about income generation in a different model. If you have a space, which is a hot commodity in the Denver metro area, can you lease it out for meetings? Can you act as a consultant to talk about API needs in the JEDI space? What is this piece that you are uniquely qualified as a subject matter expert that you can like sell to various organizations and other nonprofits that want to partner? Everyone wants to work with you, but never volunteer your service. Like, get something out of it too. I think that's the diversification piece. And I think that's it for me. I'm open to any questions that you might have. Or not.